Great. Good afternoon. I do see that we have all of our speakers. I've just double checked. I think we do have all our speakers in the session, in the room, as it were. So that's perfect. That's great. And yes, so welcome everyone to panel 2, entitled Racial Dynamics of Inclusion and Exclusion. And yeah, I'm glad you were able to make it using the link in the group, and really excited for the chat ahead. I'm very eager for us to really just jump in. I think the more time we have to give to our speakers to share their insights, and the more time we have for engaging in discussion later, that's really how it should be. I'll introduce very briefly our speakers in the order that I hope they'll go in, and if there's any reservations with that, each of us will let me know. There is a little bit of feedback, but I'll do my best to speak over it, and hopefully it's not too distracting. So welcome to our speakers, and welcome to everyone who's in the session. I think it promises to be really a great one. We have 3 impressive speakers from 2 great Eastern Cape institutions, Nelson Mandela University and Rhodes University. Our first speaker is Dr. Majavu, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Rhodes University. And he'll be speaking to us about decolonizing hiring practices at South African universities. Really looking forward to that. He'll be followed directly after that by Dr. Coetzee, who's a lecturer in the Department of Languages and Literature at Nelson Mandela University. And if I'm not mistaken, if I read your bio correctly, you have links to Rhodes University, Dr. Coetzee. So lots of cross-pollination. Our third speaker will be speaking to us about, Dr. Coetzee, will talk about the paper's titled Towards the Destruction of Whiteness as Condition for the Possibility of Reconciliation in South Africa. It sounds really meaty. Our third speaker, Pedro Mzileni from Nelson Mandela University, who's a PhD sociology candidate. That might have changed, and he can correct me when he takes to the floor. His paper is titled Degrees of Higher Education Precariousness for Unregistered Students, Displacements, Exploitations, and Forced Labor. A lot to contend with in each of those 3 papers. And we will be strict with time as far as possible to ensure that each speaker has enough time to engage us, and then have a really good and engaging Q&A. Please remember to use the chat for any questions as we go along, and we can collect the questions as we go. Without any more time wasted with the intro, I think let's hand right over to Dr.
Hello. So thank you. So you put up my presentation. Okay, great. So now do I have control of this, or you have control of this?
The tech support will control the presentation, so you could just give them a heads up when you need to move.
All right. So you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay. So I mean, what I'm trying to do here is to historicize, the hiring practices in post-apartheid South Africa, and my really, my jumping off point is that ever since whiteness became a legal category in the 17th century, being white has meant that whites enjoy a privileged status. It has meant that whites sort of almost naturally entitled, to white-collar managerial jobs. It has meant that whites are always seen as the people who are suitable, to supervise work and workplaces, okay, and supervise and manage, Black people. Okay, so that history is long-standing. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So I basically argue that first and foremost, the social acceptance of slavery by whites, okay, was based on a racializing logic that created boundaries between those who could and those who could not be enslaved, okay, and so by whiteness, what I really mean here, is really a global systems of dominance that favor whites, that have in turn nurtured racism, white supremacy, slavery, colonialism, apartheid. Charles Mills, conceptualized this system as an unnamed political system that maintains the global, racial contract. In other words, really, whiteness is a slave-making ideology. Okay, I mean, whiteness, it is a race-making ideology. And to quote, sorry, can you move on to the next slide, please? And to quote here, Goldberg, whiteness really stands socially for status and superiority. Politically, whiteness stands for power and control. And economically, whiteness stands for privilege and property. And culturally, whiteness stands for just basically arrogance and self-assertion, right? And so in this racialized, conceptual framing of the world, blacks perform menial tasks. Okay, they perform hard labor, while whites, on the other hand, they watch, they supervise, and they manage. I mean, this is just sort of played out in just day-to-day South Africa in 21st century, right? Sorry, this is a bit distracting having someone else controlling the slide, but I'm just trying to see where I'm at now. Okay, I'm saying that 5 centuries later, okay, this racist assumption about whiteness is still alive and kicking and shapes the hiring practices at South African universities. Could you please move on to the next slide? For instance, the findings of the 2020 report of the Ministerial Task Team on the recruitment, retention, and progression of Black South African academics show that Blacks and colored academics remain underrepresented in South African universities. According to this report, please move on, please, next slide. White and Indian male and females are overrepresented at university as academic staff. African and colored male and females remain underrepresented. White females are the most overrepresented group, making up 25% of the academic staff, compared to a 4% general population share. Now, so I find, interesting that the inclusion of white women in the affirmative action, has basically led, to white women benefiting, from the Black struggle against, white racism, right? I mean, through their whiteness and via their white husbands and via their white fathers, white women have historically had, access, to life, opportunities, to societal resources, and to power, in South Africa. That's like over 3 centuries. That's just been the case, right? And so, in my view, they just don't belong in that category. African females, on the other hand, are the most underrepresented group. Okay, reflected by a 40% representation in the general population cohort, but a 16% representation in universities. Black academics are in the majority in lower level posts such as junior lecturer, while white academics are in the majority in senior posts such as senior lecturer and professors. And academic leadership at university is still dominated by white academics. So this picture here, next slide, please. This picture here created by the 2020 report of the Ministerial Task Team is really a product of the anti-Black history that we've really inherited from the previous regime. And that anti-Black racism is really characterized by this belief and assumption that the African is just unteachable. To quote Stanley Portal Heard, an English explorer who spent time in South Africa in the early 20th century. He had conceded that blacks can rapidly acquire an outward civilization, to quote him, and a veneer of polish, and consequently become this so-called pseudo-civilized man. And even the missionary schools that produced the first Black intelligentsia in South Africa, had to maintain this balancing act of so-called civilizing Black students to be useful missionary agents, but not to a point where they would aspire to something more than missionaries had in mind. This meant that education provided to Blacks was really designed to inculcate really white moral discipline and white norms of cleanliness and habits of self-control. Next slide, please. Okay. Although white missionaries were willing to work, and educate Blacks, they never, not even once, considered Blacks as their equals, right? And these condescending attitudes of white missionaries are really borne out, out of this belief by, European missionaries that, that Europeans are basically special and superior and set apart from other social groups by their civilization and by Christianity. Those two historical developments have sort of been used by white missionaries to claim positions of authority, positions of educating and so-called leading Blacks. And the 20th century Black Education Act, the Bantu Act, basically just legislated these attitudes and these racist assumptions, and legalized the unequal education between Blacks and whites, and the boundary education really emerges out of the late 19th century discussions between whites. For example, say Jacob Deckberry, the chairman of the 1891 to 1892 Education Commission, really wondered out loud, and I quote him, whether it was not better for these natives to know how to head, ship, or dig, rather than to read a newspaper, right? Historically, whites viewed Black South Africans really as a social problem that needed to be solved by whites, and hence Blacks were sort of cast as a native problem, as a native question that whites had to ponder and really try to manage and resolve. And in terms of what Blacks lived, in terms of employment available to Blacks, and so on. So I'm just mindful of the time here. Let me just speed up. Okay, and generally, the stereotype was that Blacks are lazy and so on. And we see that throughout the 19th century. In fact, the narrative dimension of the Frontier Wars is that Blacks are just in this indolent race, okay, and they are given to this disorderly habit instead of really learning the ways of the West, right? And I argue that even that really can be traced back to the 16th century, those attitudes. And if I I quote again here, Hiet. Before I quote Hiet, let me quote Harriet Ward, who was writing during the fourth Frontier War, and here she's describing so-called finger warriors, okay. And so she writes that on its green banks reclined a crowd of finger warriors in their war attire of plumes, assegais, shields of bullock hide, and their cuirasses draped gracefully round them. The chiefs wore tiger skins. Indolent they looked, basking in the sunshine, smoking dacha, the seed of a kind of wild hemp, having much the same effect as opium on the senses. And then after that, I want to quote again here, talking about the labor problems in the early 20th century. And then he writes, the most serious trouble will be the question of labor, but this is, even now, being partially overcome by the importation of Chinese into the Transvaal, while in Natal, the Indian is doing the work, which the Zulu is too lazy or too ignorant to undertake. The African native in any capacity is so useless and unsatisfactory that the white community will rejoice to be rid of his presence forever. Were it able to secure substitutes in the form of Indians or Chinese, close quote. Okay, and so in addition to bringing indentured labor, because of supposedly lazy local Blacks, white South Africans, then recruited blacks from Southern Africa to come and work in the Witwatersrand mines. And again, it was the same thing that, a lot of blacks are just too lazy, but also, whites, they found it, just convenient, to bring, blacks who were going to migrate back and forth, throughout the whole, Southern African region. But also it served the project of maintaining, this white man's country project, right? And really the group that they really liked, from Southern Africa were blacks from Mozambique. And now blacks from Mozambique have they had a very good reputation among local whites. Since the Cape slavery days, since from 1725, when the Dutch East India Company, had a slave factory in Mozambique, right? And the blacks from Mozambique were seen as diligent, as hardworking and reliable, and so that's why, the so-called Witwatersrand Native Labor Association, really had recruiting rights throughout southern Mozambique, for most of the 20th century. And for greater part of the 20th century, miners from Mozambique, were more numerous than any other group. And so I argue in this paper, the same desire to maintain, white hegemony has produced in South African University a situation whereby 34% of international staff is from Zimbabwe or Nigeria. Okay. And similar to to the 2020 report of the ministerial testing, I recognize the value of international staff, and I think that's great. But at the same time, international staff means international staff from all over the world. It doesn't mean just a dominant group from a particular one country. That's not international staffing. That's just a different project, right? And I agree, with the 2020 report of the ministerial task team that actually, and I quote here, staff matters. Stuff like employees matters. It matters who is leading the knowledge project, who is teaching, who is researching, who is making decisions about the nature of the curriculum, how it is delivered, and so on. All right. And here, I don't want to be mistaken for. I'm not saying that Black South Africans ought to have like absolute control over the academic project. That's not what I'm saying here. What I am saying, however, is that as Black South Africans, we want some kind of a recognition of some measure, of authority over ourselves, over our history, over our, over intellectual projects, that make sense of our social, political, and economic, world. And also, I'm not, against hiring of international staff. I know in South Africa, the words, xenophobia and reverse racism have basically become like a propaganda terms.
So if I could ask for rounding up, Dr. Majavu, sorry to disturb you.
No, that's fine. It's last sentence. And so I was saying, these terms, xenophobia and reverse racism are really being used as it's really to carry out, this moral inquisition against anyone, who reads and understands the social world differently in post-apartheid South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Majavu. And I imagine there's a lot that will come through in that. We'll, as I said, collect questions as we go and address them at the end. Dr. Coetzee, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, a question raised by the conference conveners asks if reconciliation is essential for democratization. My answer is no. Fundamental transformation is an ethical and practical imperative that is long overdue. It cannot be held hostage by a minority of citizens whose position maintains the privatized new apartheid that Sizwe Mpofu Walsh analyzes extensively in his important new book. Whether or not a sizable number of white South Africans chooses to participate, the decolonizing project must proceed with urgency. I believe that we must also problematize the term reconciliation and question its applicability to our context. Its primary meaning, the re-establishment of friendly relations after a quarrel, implies an equivalence in power and may also suggest a moral equivalence between the warring parties. Perhaps the religious meaning of the term is more pertinent, as in the Catholic Church's sacrament of confession. Here, however, at least in theory, reconciliation cannot occur without remorse and commitment to change. Forgiveness is not withheld, but an individual receive it. With regard to addressing the wrongs of whiteness, the point is not only individual acts and inaction, though these are addressed at the personal level. More crucially, it must be recognized that white people have been racialized within a toxic culture that constantly reinforces its own sense of entitlement. It is not enough to consciously hate racism and hope all will be well. If even white people who wish to be anti-racist continue to inhabit cultural change within it. Race is a social construct. If there are no intrinsic racial characteristics, then this must also apply in terms of ethics. At the level of the individual person, there is nothing particularly good or bad about Black or white people. Nevertheless, an immense collective wrong has been committed, and racism continues in the present. Fortunately, there has been widespread failure to acknowledge and take responsibility for this trauma on the part of South Africa. Everyday life experience makes plain what many studies to embrace transformation and the active opposition of many towards it. This situation does not have optimism about achieving a non-racial future. Nonetheless, the fact that a desirable outcome is unlikely does not entail its impossibility, but should rather redouble our efforts towards it. In Kupano Matwa's novel, Coconut, the character of Filwe presents what I think of as her alphabet of whiteness, alongside accounts of childhood memories concerning her white friend Belinda, from whom she has separated herself. And I quote, "After sun, bikini, ballet, Barbie and Ken, cruise, Disneyland, disco, diamonds and pearls, Easter egg, fettuccine, frappe, fork and knife, gymnastics, horse riding, horticulture, house in the hills, indoor cricket, jungle gym, jacuzzi, jumping jacks, looks like trouble, made native nameless. No, madam, Napoleon, ocean, overthrow, occupy and rule, palace, quantity, quantify, queen of England, sunscreen, suntan, sex on the beach, Tinkerbell, unicorn, oopsie daisy, unwrap them all at once, video game, wide web, wireless connection, Xmas, yoga, yo-yo diet, you and you, zero guilt." This list of associations presents seemingly innocent items amongst terms that show domination present. For Ofilwe, it represents a painful coming to awareness that the culture of whiteness in which being partially assimilated is one that ultimately excludes and harms her. As such, it seems to be a reason for a painful kind to dismantle white. I believe that it is necessary to banish nostalgia, or at least treat it with the utmost suspicion. Anyone who believes they have any innocent memories of apartheid South Africa needs to think again. All aspects of the past need to be reconfronted, especially those ideas with which whites have imagined their connections to land and the ways in which they have imagined connections to Black people. Nelson Mandela's famous words about people being taught to love because it becomes more easily to the human heart prove insufficient in the face of racialized culture. I would argue that destroying white does not only mean working against racist hate and indifference, it would also require separation. Within that entanglement, strange forms of imagined love for have always occurred within whiteness and have often provided support for the alibis with which it seeks to absolve it. There is a sizable body of literary work by white South African writers presenting white people in relationships with domestic workers who are objectified as loving carers, bearing the costs of emotional labor in addition to physical tasks. I once saw a home movie from the 1960s of a child's birthday party. In every frame, a black arm was visible, but the face of the person to whom the arm belonged did not appear in a single. That representation is more accurate in depicting the horror of domestic labor than any parts of it as a site in which genuine relationships occur across racialized boundaries. Motlele Tane recounts her childhood trauma of being imprisoned while visiting her mother. Because my mother worked as a live-in worker, she had to sneak me into her quarters in the early hours of Monday mornings, and the next time I saw the light of day on Friday afternoons when we returned home to Everton. In Eskian Patlele's short story, Mzileni, the eponymous character does not refuse to pay the protagonist or subject her to sexual harassment as she experienced previously. Nonetheless, though Mrs. Plum claims to love Africans, Karabo realizes she is like all other white women. This story depicts hardships, but also shows agency among Black domestic work, who support one another and protect their sanity by resisting emotional entanglement in their employers' lives. A fictionalized Lillian Goy appears in the story and states that a master and a servant can never be friends. Never. So put that out of your head, will you? You are not even sure the ones you say are good are not like that because they cannot breathe or live without the work of your hands. Representation of Black writers like Mpatlele and many others serve as a corrective to any kind of romanticizing of racialized work. The question of land and whiteness is another area that needs to be rethought against nostalgic tendencies. South Africa's geography is indelibly marked by colonialism and apartheid in both rural and urban areas. Writing in 1999, Jabulo Ndebele remarks on the colonial character of game and argues that the liberation of leisure is an important aspect of the new experience of freedom. For white people, memories of happy holidays and all kinds of tourism need to be reconsidered in this regard. Paraphrasing Alan Paton, our land indeed is beautiful, but it was stolen, and access to its beauty has been denied to most inhabitants who have experienced forced migration, deportation, and imprisonment. Dismantling whiteness in South Africa would entail a radical reimagining of land in relation to identity. In conclusion, the tendency of whiteness in what Achille Mbembe calls self-fictionalization and self-contemplation requires caution with regard to white people's narratives. I suggest that we need to approach all the stories about ourselves with suspicion and spend much more time listening. In Necropolitics, Mbembe comments that the Judeo-Christian influenced traditions of European thought are fixated on ideas of catastrophe or apocalypse. By contrast, he argues, African traditions are focused more on relatedness and transformation without rupture in continuity. At the same time, after slavery and colonialism, for a large share of humanity, in his words, the end of the world has already occurred. Conscious of the dangers and seeking not to appropriate Black experience in any way, I would nonetheless suggest that for white people, destruction of whiteness would involve something akin to the end of a particular world. What then? I will close by continuing the pre-quotation from Mbembe, which evokes a sense of loss, but also of possibility. The question is no longer to know how to live life while awaiting it. Instead, it is to know how living will be possible the day after the end. That is to say, how to live with separation. How can the world be recreated in the wake of the world's destruction? For this share of humanity, a loss of world obliges the undoing of that which hitherto had constituted the essential aspect of material, psychic, and symbolic engagements. To develop an ethics of renunciation in relation to what was there yesterday has disappeared today and must now be forgotten, since, in any case, a life is there after the end. The end does not amount to the ultimate limit of life. Something in the process of life defies all ideas of the end. By contrast, loss and its corollary separation represent a decisive crossing. But though all separation is somewhere loss, not all loss necessarily amounts to an end of the world. There are liberating that open onto other registers of life and relation. There are losses that participate in necessity because they guarantee survival. There are objects and investments from which one must separate precisely so as to ensure their continued existence. Similarly, an attachment to certain objects and investments can only in the end result in the destruction of the ego and the objects in question. And I will close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and well within time. Also, just noted that I'm not sure if it's mine, it might be my own internet or your internet, but it was touch and go, although we heard you clearly. So that, yeah, from beginning to end, thank you so much. I think directly, yeah, handing over now to our last third speaker on the panel before we open up for what I know will be a really fruitful engagement. Already seeing some really great questions in the chat. Over to you, Pedro.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. So the topic that is written here on the program under my name, it came from one of the chapters of my PhD, and I came across this population of unregistered students towards the end of my data collection in Kabe. So I came across it by mistake, because initially I intended to do research about 3 student communities that are in Kabe. So we have a university there, very big multi-campus university called Nelson Mandela University, which is hosting the conference. That city is located in a suburb called Summerstrand. And it was built there in the 1960s through the architectural logic of the apartheid government. So Port Elizabeth, as an apartheid city, also constructed the University of Port Elizabeth in the white suburb of Summerstrand as a small institution. And then after 94, when higher education began to massify, that university was now unable to accommodate its students on campus. As a result, over 80% of the student population in this university is residing in the city. But this very same city is also an apartheid city. It's a colonial city itself. So you have a colonial city and a colonial university coexisting with each other. And this colonial city now has the ability to accommodate over 15,000 students democratically and conducively for purposes of learning and living. The city is unable to do that. So student populations in the city are scattered all over the place in very dangerous areas of the city. So I took time to study the political economy of higher education in these terms, looking at the relationship between the city and the university in the post-apartheid period. So I looked at the student population that was residing in Summerstrand, which is this former white suburb. Also the population in the CBD, which I will explain later on, and then the last population, which was in the township. So I was focusing on those three. Then there's this fourth one now. This community of unregistered students. When I began doing this research about 6 or 7 years ago, at the level of my honors even, the population of unregistered students was very small. In fact, you hardly had unregistered students in the university. They will be unregistered in January and February, and then by March, everyone is in the system. But this year, when I was concluding the doctoral studies, suddenly now the population of unregistered students is actually big. I'm talking about thousands of students who are residing in the city and they are not registered, even now in September, but they are residing in the city. They are unregistered. So what is going on? What is going on with the higher education system in these times? So I had to add a fourth chapter now to focus on this population of unregistered students that has grown in significant numbers in just a space of 3 years into thousands and thousands of students. So the fourth chapter now looks at this population of unregistered students, and they reside in one specific area in the city, which I call the north end margins of the city that have deindustrialized. So there's an area in Port Elizabeth, for those who are familiar with the city, right at the edge of the city, at the border between the township and as you're about to enter the city. This is where factories were before the city deindustrialized. That area has been converted now into a huge student community that mainly houses the poorest of the poor, but most importantly, also unregistered students. The university knows about this area. Government knows about this area, but it looks like it is a very convenient area for them. It's very convenient for the university and for the government to have that area so that they dump students there that they seem to be unable to cushion within the formal structures of funding and enrollment that they use to operationalize and govern higher education in our times. And that area, the property owners on that space generate significant revenue from this population of students, some of them who later get funded by financial aid. So the state finances this informal area that is deindustrialized for it to continue. But I want to draw a quick context quickly. Cities in South Africa are products of colonialism. The city structure is a product of conquest, dispossession, the migrant labor system, and the racist settlements that were mainly anchored by the Group Areas Act in the 50s. So the outcome of the township, the outcome of the urban center, the suburb, the South African suburb, is mainly a product of the Group Areas Act. So universities emerge out of that context. if you look at the location of all major former white universities, just think about where they are located, the address of universities, where they are built. There's a specific purpose why they are built where they are. There's a reason why Stellenbosch University is where it is, where UCT is, where Wits University is, where Rhodes University is, and then also where Nelson Mandela University is. If I had time, I'll dwell further on those reasons. But let's zoom quickly to Port Elizabeth as I now go to the second last point. Port Elizabeth as the city, if you look at it between 1860 and 1930, that was a period of industrialization in the city. The factories and the port economy was booming during that period. And this is also the period of the growth of the townships in the city, because Black people were sourced from the dispossessed margins and the rural communities where their land was, and they were moved as cheap migrant labor into the city of Port Elizabeth. Those are the migration patterns of the Eastern Cape. So 1860 to 1930 was a period of industrialization. Then the period of 1930 to 1970, that period is very important, especially for the development of higher education in South Africa. Because that is when now the white economy, the white apartheid economy, the white colonial economy began to commercialize. So the focus now was on building a professional class of accountants, engineers, doctors amongst white people. And hence you see the emergence of CBDs in the city. So the CBD we have, which is now called Govan-Beki Road, if you see all those tall buildings there, most of them matured during the period of the 1930s and 1970s. And this is the very same period when the university was also built. Then the period from 1970 to 2000 was now the area where the city began to deindustrialize. The urban space began to decay. Large de-investments were being driven during that period. And as a result, the rates of unemployment increased significantly. Now, the democratic government of the ANC, when it came into power in 1994, it negotiated power for itself. It received it in 1994, state power that is, but it handed that power back in 1996 to the market and asked the market to drive a program of transformation on its behalf. Of course, the market didn't do that. In other words, after 96, deindustrialization accelerated even further, and it caused a serious decay, especially in the CBD areas of all major cities of South Africa. So if you look at the former CBDs in major cities of South Africa, they've all decayed. Durban, Johannesburg, Gqeberha as well. There has been a serious flight of capital away from the CBD into the new suburbs now that have been established in these cities. But for higher education, it was the opposite, because the rates of urbanization continued to rise in these major cities of the country because Black people, by colonial design, were not allowed into the city. So despite in the European context or in the American context, where you'll find a depopulation of a city during its period of de-investment and unemployment, in South Africa, it was the opposite. When the city deindustrialized, decayed, and deinvested, and the rates of unemployment increased, urbanization also increased at the very same breath. And then on the higher education question, rates of enrollments also began to increase in significant numbers, especially during the period of 2007 up to 2016. From 2017 to 2021, massification multiplied massively. But now the question was there any available infrastructure to accommodate these massification numbers? And the answer is no. And that is why, therefore, a large number of students are now staying in former abandoned buildings that are located in the CBD and even in the manufacturing sites that have deindustrialized since '94. So when you speak about the political economy of higher education in South Africa in local terms, in local geographic terms, because interrogations about higher education have focused on curriculum questions, research questions, racism and so on. But if you zoom down and look at the university as a local role player, its immediate geography, the political economy surrounding its immediate surrounding, you get to see a different story as far as the political economy of higher education is concerned. These students that are now at the receiving end of the defunding of higher education, deindustrialization of these cities, and the decay of the cities, they are now occupying these abandoned CBD areas, these manufacturing sites, and most of them are unregistered students because there's no funding available to finance the declarations that have been made to massify higher education. And that is why, therefore, the daily experiences of these students that are unregistered, they operate as forced labor, they are exploited and they are displaced, both by the city itself and also by the university itself. Most people are not aware that major protests that are happening in higher education, especially during the registration period between January and March, a large number of those protests are actually conducted by students that are not students. Most of the protests as well that take place during the year are a large number of students that participate in those protests are also those that are unregistered. The property owners of these abandoned buildings and factories also use these students. They exploit them and force them to do unrecognized labor for them to continue staying in these abandoned buildings and so forth. So there's a large illicit economy taking place in the city, especially the night economy, using students that are unregistered as commodities. So if ever we are to understand the structure and the political economy of post-apartheid higher education, its levels of precariousness, the layers and the outliers of the system, we need to pay attention now to this growing community of unregistered students and the precariousness of their daily lives in these urban cities that have decayed over the last few years. Let me pause there, Chair. I see that you are coming up. I'll resume the conversation during the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you. You had a few seconds remaining, so I hope my face didn't derail you too much. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for keeping to time. I think it does create space for us to have a really rich discussion. Across the three papers, we've been taken on a fantastic historical journey, and right up to contemporary South Africa and context of racialized inclusion and exclusions, with a look at the labor markets and the higher education context. I think the historical roots of the racist stereotypes that we heard at the beginning in the 17th century, were there like roots in that context, and later the use of that same discourse in recruiting Black labor across Southern Africa is certainly something that I think is already coming through in the questions. From Dr. Coetzee, we heard the hard-hitting notion of the relationships between labor and destruction or dismantling of whiteness. We heard an even harder hitting, I think, notion of Blackness as a social problem. And then, again, this notion of sort of, I think between the papers, really some really intricate sort of weaving of a particular line of discussion. So I think, to really just ending off on the third paper, Pedro taking us into the relationship between the city and the university and the implications of the historical context of institutions like ours. When I say ours, Rhodes University, Nelson Mandela University, and others, and what that means in terms of the logic of apartheid era spatial planning. I was quite hit hard by your concluding points around the illicit market, the illicit night context, and the political economy of higher education institutions. So I think let's really just go into the discussion. I, for one, wish I was a participant, that I could ask questions, because I have many, but I will not abuse my position. So beginning with some questions, I think it yeah, I'll maybe read 3 questions to begin with, hand over to speakers, and then come back again into more questions. And maybe just to also, a small disclaimer is to say, I know I'm likely mistitling my panel, and I hope that they are okay with me now reverting to first name basis. If not, we can have harsh words with me after the panel. So I will drop titles for now, if that's okay. The first question, thank you. The first question, Mandisi, someone says, Carla Mostert says she's researching what role white women can play in academia. How can we best use our power to improve hiring practices? And she'd like to hear your opinion on that. I'll ask Paulette the question, how do we as white scholars begin to rethink our involvement in broadly defined African culture, particularly topics such as African music and figures like Hugh Tracy? And then to Pedro, compliments on your presentation, and could you please say more about citizenship status of informal students and responses of city planning authorities? So a question to each speaker, and you're welcome to answer it in that order, please.
Okay, so thank you for that question. Perhaps I should, preface my answer by stating that, pointing out a problem and researching academic, problems is actually a legitimate exercise, without providing solutions to that problem. That's just adequate. Okay, right? It does not necessarily mean that because you're pointing out problems, you have to then follow up with solutions. Okay, but now let me attempt, to think through this this question. Now, how do we, what role could white women play in decolonizing the hiring practices in South African universities? So here, really, what we have here, to answer that question is history, because that's really where we have to look. There's nowhere else. I mean, otherwise we're going to engage in fiction, right? Now, so if you look at South African history, how did Blacks, try to break away from, domineering, influence of whites, throughout the 19th century, from white missionaries who were educators, who were in control of the whole education project, who were in control of the whole, Christianity project. Now, late 19th century, first, so we see Soga, for example, okay, pointing out that actually the Bible that was translated into Xhosa by Appleyard, by white missionaries, actually is just wrong, and it's just bad Xhosa and so on. And that caused a lot of problems, okay, for Soga, a huge backlash, right? And then he dies early, but then other Blacks, come up and more or less they pick up the same struggle. And then they form their own churches, so-called Black independent churches, Ethiopianism, right? Because white missionaries, as much as they were viewed as liberals, just refused to let go of positions of power, and because they felt that Blacks were just not ready. They just haven't mastered Marx. They just haven't mastered this ideology, and this other ideology that appeals to them. This is just not right, okay? This Ethiopianism, okay, we don't like it, and it's anti-white, and all kinds of pejorative labels were thrown at those Blacks, right? So what I'm saying here is that actually, the problem goes beyond individual people. I'm talking about structures here of society that shape, hiring practices, that shape, ideologies that are seen as legitimate, to try and ponder and grapple with, and individuals just don't feature, in the solution there at all, unfortunately. But what history suggests is that actually movements, social movements and political organizations, they can really change the narrative. That's what we've seen, and That's what I'm suggesting as well. Thanks.
Led?
Okay, hope you can hear me now. Yeah. Oh yes. Oh, Hugh Tracy. Yeah. I'm not sure. Of the topics, I'm not sure. I presume you mean. I mean, Hugh Tracy was obviously one of those who was involved in study and recording African culture, African music, and I worked on him, of course. Interesting example of colonial whiteness, and I think very historically interesting, and also the contradiction associated with Tracy. I mean, I came to work on Tracy because I happened to get a job at ILAM at some point, so I was sitting in the archive surrounded by Tracy's stuff, and the more and his picture on the wall, and like the ghost of Tracy, like, sort of, you know, going wishing through the building every day. And then the more I read, because I wasn't a very good librarian, but I was always reading the books instead of putting them in order. The more I read of Tracy's own ideas, and the more I could see these contradictions between the narrative of ILAM and what it was actually about and what happened, especially when I started correspondence. So I worked with that in my PhD, and I've had some publications as a result. But that whole story, it's also what's been interesting is the kind of resistance and sort of not even resistance, you know, through that work, I've also learned what it's like to be made invisible, because it's you know, I've been in contact with people literally just don't see me, you know, I greet them and I'm not there. You know, you actually feel like a ghost because they look right through you. So, you know, that has happened. And unfortunately, you know, I mean, it was a journey for me, but, you know, I was sort of shocked, almost like me saying, hey, you know, like this heresy, Hugh Tracy was a racist, look. But gradually, as I did more, I realized, well, that sort of Tracy bus, you know, I've gone as far as I can go with it, because the people who still don't want to, who don't want to kind of allow their hero to be tainted, you know, don't want to listen. And those that you know, think differently, and most Black people already know, you know, that Tracy was a racist. So if I talk about him, I am also at the danger of reinscribing. So, you know, hopefully that work was of some, but I sort of, you know, had to move on from there, and also the toxicity of it. And in fact, I hadn't, you know, I left ILAM, I finished my PhD, and after I had completed it, I came across further material that was even worse, you know, anything I had previously found on him. But yeah, the whole area of music is one of the things that I think my sort of the ideas I'm still working through, and that I've touched on in this paper about the need to think to kind of try to banish nostalgia. I think music is one of the areas that white people have to work on, because there's been so much appropriation of African Black music, and you know, by whiteness. The whole of popular music for the last century has pretty much gone on elements of it, and you know, many white people love you know, types of music like jazz, African music, etc., and it's sort of part of the way they feel about themselves, you know, both musically and from America and other places. But you know, that love for Black music, how can it coexist? I think, you know, there's examination of those areas. I think music is complicated, so I haven't gone very far with the thinking, but I feel that there's a huge need to try and interrogate of the attitudes and feelings around music with regard to Africa and culture and whiteness.
Thanks, Paulette. And Pedro?
Yeah, no, thanks. On the question of city planning authorities, I actually wanted to touch on that. How state power has behaved on these questions since 94. There are two major differences. During the industrial period, mainly in the 20th century, during the apartheid period, the large driver of capital development was the state during that period. Even the distribution of industries across the Eastern Cape, you look at the industries that have collapsed today, but if you look at where they are, in Timbaza, Tanzania, Zwelicha, Queenstown, Mthatha, the entire landscape of the Eastern, a large body of those manufacturing industries during the 20th century were driven by the state. After 94, what has happened is that the state now retreated as the main driver of capital development. In other words, the process of urbanization, the process of city development, city renewal, the state now retreated as the main driver of that development. And what has come now in its place is only the university. But the university is such a small role player compared to the full might of the state that it was playing before 94. And all that the university does is to tiptoe. It's playing as a soft state, basically, through the provision of student accommodation in the city. So the areas that have deindustrialized, which are these manufacturing sites, mainly from North End in Gqeberha all the way down close to Colchester. If you look at those areas, including some areas in the township, a large part of them now are being replaced by student accommodation. If you look at the CBD itself, a large part of it also is being replaced by student accommodation. And the municipality is now coming in to introduce a concept of CBD renewal or urban renewal, which is to basically beautify the streets, the walls, and so on. Something similar to what they did before the 2010 Soccer World Cup in all major cities. But that arm of the municipality is very soft in playing a significant role in reversing the current trajectory of underdevelopment that is facing major cities. So city planning authorities, there's absolutely no significant, decisive, and impactful intervention that they can make to tamper with the informal areas of the city that are currently accommodating students. All that they do at the moment is to play an engagement role in issues of crime and security. And even in that aspect, all they offer are patrolling services, nothing significant to play a decisive role in preventing crime as a social structural problem in the city facing students. They are unable to play that role. The university itself is also unable to play that role. So the state of South Africa, the only time the state in South Africa has a strong arm, it is only when it comes to collecting your taxes. When it comes to collecting tax from your salary or from the value-added tax, the state is very strong. It has a strong arm when it comes to that area. But when it comes to influencing development, driving capital flows, right, towards the underdeveloped areas, not only of the city, but across the country, the state is unable to drive that kind of development. So the question of higher education, its pressing challenges such as defunding, the slow pace of transformation and decolonization, it is still going to be hinged, if you look at it carefully, a large portion of that program from being a success. One area that is going to keep pulling it back is this leg of the political economy of higher education, especially political economies that are anchored in the cities where these universities are. You can't separate Stellenbosch University from the economy of Stellenbosch and the amount of stronghold the Stellenbosch economy has on the university. The same applies with UCT, the same applies also with Nelson Mandela University. So we sit and think that these forces have been defeated and therefore we're driving transformation in our own terms. It's not the case. If you look at the operations of the university, right, and the logic of itself institutionally, yes, universities might have changed organizationally, but if you look at their operations institutionally, they are still loyal to the colonial legacy of where they come from, especially their political economies, right? So if you follow the commerce of research, the commerce of teaching, and the commerce of the everyday operations of universities in terms of their procurement patterns, their economies, and who they actually belong to in financial and institutional terms, you realize that the beast of the past is still very much alive in these universities. And it is expressed deeply in the cities where they are and the role they continue to play. And the bodies of students who are Black that continue being the very same victims of this system that we're trying to transform and decolonize. So the researchers who are doing work on the local economies of universities and their geographies, they now need to have a serious conversation with the ones who are busy with curriculum transformation work, with the demographic transformation work of universities. I see Professor Majavu and also Prof. Paulette, the work that they are doing. Now, the work that is being expressed on their own end, it needs now to articulate one paradigm with the work that you are doing as well on this side as critical geographers of higher education in cities. Because these two forces, they breathe life to one another, right? As much as universities are colonial in terms of whiteness and so on, their spatial existence as well is also a colonial outcome, right? They are built in apartheid cities, in colonial cities, also as subjects of colonialism themselves. So the city structure, the city planning forces cannot be left behind in discussing questions of transformation and decolonization in our times. And that is the intervention I am providing with this study that I have done.
That's wonderful. It sounds like really important work. We have some additional questions, and I'll turn our order on its head a little bit in terms of, so the first question, and I'll read it verbatim. Dr. Coetzee, I was intrigued by the white alphabet you quoted from Coconut. Would you be able to repeat that reference or the page number so I could look it up? And maybe actually, I've now lost track of who asked that, but it might just for those of us who aren't entirely familiar with the book, a little bit, of elaboration on its links. The second question, and actually, in fact, two questions are directly to Prof. Majavu. The first being, Dr. Mandisi, thanks for a thought-provoking presentation. What does the report, and I imagine it's the higher, the Ministerial Task Team report that the question refers to, what does the report say about the representation of academics from the global north in South African higher education, and what are your thoughts on that? If you're happy with me hitting you with the second question immediately, so you can answer them both one after the other. The second one is, thanks, Prof. Majavu. I like that your input goes beyond human resource processes to analyze hiring practices in higher education institutions in South Africa. What forces do you see as influencing these practices? Yeah, so let's try to take those two, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. Perhaps if I could ask that for each of the questions, where possible, keep them succinct so that we can try and answer all the questions that have been raised. So the first on coconut and white alphabet, and any further sort of elaboration you'd like to add there.
Okay, yes. Well, it's on page 42 of the novel, at least the edition that I have. It's the way that coconut is structured as a text means that it's a kind of mosaic structure, and the separate pieces are not linked. So you have sort of pieces of the past and the present alongside one another as each character moves through one day. But this section occurs or close to other sections that deal with Ophielwe bumping into her ex-friend Belinda. She used to spend a lot of time with when they were small, when they were, from in the early grades at school, when they were best ever, and she used to visit Belinda's house. So there are memories around that friendship, and then this section is just, it's not explained within the text. So I read it as an alphabet of whiteness, but it's, it's one of the poetic sections of the novel. And Coconut is a novel that I'm currently teaching and have been teaching for I've taught it at the University of Zululand and here at Nelson Mandela as well. And it's that I'm learning from every time I come back to it. And students also seem to find that it's a rich text. Yeah, I know I'll stop and because we must be brief, but just briefly I wanted to respond because I was really, really interested in Pedro, what you were saying, and not a lot of time. Maybe we could have further conversations, but I think your work is so important, but I help think about my experiences at the University of Zululand and the experiences of students there, kind of appalling conditions that students on campus, around campus, off campus deal with. And there's a similar problem each year of the unregistered students, people who arrive, who don't get in, and all the trauma around that. So obviously this is a problem in all our university spaces, but I wondered, whether you were going to expand your study to look at those sort of universities, black universities like UniZulu, etc. And I think that it could be that they to be done in that regard, and that also raises some of the other, as well as the issues you've raised, which occur in those places as well. It also raises some of the things that Prof. Mandani was talking about in terms of, former homelands, traditional authorities, etc., etc., etc. But anyway, thanks. Sorry, I didn't want to take up time. I was just very, very interested in your work. Thanks.
Okay. So the breakdown of scholars from the north. So the report shows scholars from the UK at 6%. Okay, so 25% is Zimbabwean academics, 9% Nigerians, and then 6% is academics from UK. And then we've got Germany at 5%, USA at 4%, and the rest is just basically just not significant enough. And what my thoughts are on that, I mean, the global north basically still shapes the academic project as far as ideology and discourses are concerned. So they don't really need to be here to influence and shape that project. And the decolonization project is resisting that, is challenging that by expanding our epistemological projects, by asking different questions, by providing different forms of evidence. We need more of that work. With regards to the second question, what forces do you see as influencing these hiring practices? Yeah. So really here, I mean, what I'm describing here is really a cocktail of toxic, discourses, right? Just combining, to produce, this negative experience for Blacks, right? And I'm saying actually, that discourse, it just goes way back, it's centuries old. And but also another discourse here that has been really hijacked by white liberals and others as well is really this incomplete process of reckoning with what Blackness means, right? So what Blackness means in South Africa. So everyone wanted to talk about Biko. Biko said this, Biko said that, right? Okay, now Biko, was talking in 1970 in a particular, historical context that I mean, so this was really a political slogan, actually, I mean, it was a slogan that didn't go far, deep into broader societies, into the colored community, into the Indian community. Those communities were never historically convinced that they were Black. Maybe, a group of colored activists and a group of Indian activists were convinced, right? And that's as far as it goes. That's just historical evidence. It's just not even my opinion, right? And but now is Biko, observation here correct? Well, I mean, again, the evidence we have here to see, how race making took place in South Africa and how different so-called races were constructed and made, disagrees with this observation, disagrees with how, for example, Indians were constructed in the late 19th century when they brought here as indentured laborers. I mean, they were probably, by the end of that century, Indians were probably acclimatized to the racial, environment of South Africa, and they knew how to treat Blacks, and they treated them according to a white logic. Similarly, I mean, so the colored, community, how it gets built from slavery in the 17th, 18th century, how different kinds of colors of slaves are ranked depending on whether, their heritage is of European or other descent, right? I mean, that racial laboratory, it goes for 2 centuries, okay? And it produces a colored elite by the end of the 19th century that is convinced and committed to advocating for colored interests. And that goes all the way throughout the 20th century, right? And again, there's just maybe a group of activists join Biko and others, and that's as far as it goes. And in 1994, when Mandela runs for president, and this again shows where the allegiances are, for the colored community, and then they vote for the National Party, right? Like the architect of this white supremacist project, right? So that's a part of that. Problem here, and we just refuse to engage with it. Okay, people are just so dishonest, right? Because the subject is very sensitive, and I get that. But again, this is our history, and that's it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I think I can certainly speak for everyone to say that was an amazing series of observations, and the papers, I'm looking forward to reading them. And in particular, it's probably one of the first times I can definitely say when I can get my hands on it, I will look up a thesis, Pedro. So that sounds like there's many others on the call who will do the same. So I think we are out of time. I think I am correct on that. And I'm pretty sure that we have not missed out any questions. If I have done, in terms of my moderating, please do forgive me. It is completely a mistake if I've missed out a question that you raised. Thank you so much to everyone that joined the panel. And I think, yeah, diverse perspectives, but really important perspectives on a very difficult subject, but one that certainly, I think it does sound to me, we've got some, activist orientations within our higher education institutions, and these are questions that we should be deliberating on. I found it really interesting, Prof. Majavu, that you, in your reflection, that on the one hand, raising some of these questions and profiling or visibilizing them need not mean we also need to at the same time be finding solutions. But I certainly think that the mix in this conference of academics, of activists, of practitioners makes for exactly the kind of environment that I think the organizers are aiming for. So I really will end there. What I think, and hopefully the organizers will forgive me for this, I'm very keen that the session ends not on my voice, but ends on panelist voices, and perhaps we will have a technical note at the very, very end. We do have, a few seconds remaining. What I'd like to put our speakers on the spot for is just 30-second response, 30 seconds, with just a sense of, is there some level of hope in terms of contemporary South Africa, the direction we're going in? I know that's opening up a can of worms, but perhaps really just this or that in terms of where we're at this point in our historical trajectory. We'll go in the order that we began in, and then I'll hand over to our technical team to close us off.
Sorry, so the question is whether we're going towards the right direction, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I am hopeful, but, I don't think we are going in the right direction. Hopefully we can correct that.
Thank you. There's hope. Dr. Coetzee.
Yeah, I don't know. I am hopeful. I'm hopeful, like hearing and in these kinds of contexts. Of South Africa don't fill me with much hope, and working on whiteness, I don't find much hope within circles associated with white people. There seems to just be stasis. But my observations of South Africa is that there seems to be a lot going on. There seems to be a lot of renewed engagement, a lot of debate, a lot of change, a lot of diverse perspectives, and people trying to find solutions. There are also obviously a few white people amongst that sort of group, but yeah. So is in case I think there is hope, but in some circles, no. Yeah.
Thank you. Pedro, you close us off.
Yeah, no, I think South Africa comes from a very difficult place. We've come so far. And the future belongs to young people. So I think it's our time. So we will take the baton and move the country to greater heights. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks to the audience. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and see you at 3.
Thank you very much. It sounds like it was a very rich conversation. Unfortunately, I had to hop between rooms, but I just want to tell people that our next panels will, as Zukiswa has pointed out, start at 3 o'clock. And if you want to join the Higher Education and Social Justice panel, we will post a link here now for you to go back to the main room. And if you would prefer to stay where you are and stay on for the Decolonizing and Africanizing Democracy panel, just stay right where you are. There's the link in the chat if you would like to go to the main auditorium for Higher Education and Social Justice. Thank you, everybody.